Hi, and welcome to Two or Three Gathered. My name is Caleb, and I am joined today with my co-host Jared Grant.
Hey guys.
Um, Today we will be discussing the upcoming New Zealand referendum on cannabis and end-of-life choice. Now, just as a bit of a backstory for our podcast, Two or Three Gathered. It is a series of conversations with brothers and sisters considering their efforts and contributions to the kingdom vocationally, their stories and their testimonies of God's sovereignty and grace, and an opportunity to tackle the relevant issues that the church faces in the 21st century. In this, we seek to equip the saints by networking within the body, starting the conversation around often taboo subjects, and seeking to develop unity across Christian denominations and traditions by starting the conversation on worthy topics. We want to educate the wider body of Christ by asking these experts and people of wisdom across multiple fields in the hot button questions and sophisticated questions that we believe there are answers for in Christ's church, but that there is not necessarily much access to. It is our heart that Christ himself would be in our midst as we converse about these things. We believe he himself is very interested in. Cool. So today we will be, as I said, discussing the upcoming ever divisive, ever daunting cannabis regulation bill and end-of-life choice bill. Today, Jared will be discussing as our quote-unquote expert and on the end-of-life bill, and I will be our resident scholar on cannabis. I have some lined up and ready to get going, so see some fumes. I'm just practicing what I preach. No, I could.
That's why you seem so enlightened, right? Like, so, like you can see truths we don't.
Yeah, definitely. It opens up your mind to a whole new world.
Yeah, definitely. Well, can I speak to that, man? Like,
Yes, sure.
yeah, like, both Caleb and I thought like we wanted to tackle this for you, the audience. We wanted to tackle this for you, the audience, from your perspective, because we imagine that most people are, they're looking up sources and material around this topic, and so they're looking for, someone who is a relative or relevant expert in the field. But then most of us are also coming as kind of like the uneducated, but intelligent novices, having our own opinions, having our own experiences around the subject, and we're bringing that into our viewing of that material. So we wanted to, I think Caleb and I, play on that a little bit to actually say, we both have researched both of these bills and the conversations and the topics around these bills, so that we're both kind of coming in with both inexperience, but also some wisdom, hopefully some wisdom to offer. Because by no means I would say that our efforts have been exhaustive, right? But we're hoping that we can do a good enough job to actually present on these topics. Would that be fair to say, man?
Yeah, definitely. Like I, jokingly call myself a resident scholar. It's definitely all in jest. But I do feel I have discussed this plenty with other people leading up to this, and also done a fair amount of research on what is easily accessible. And obviously we'll be linking all relevant articles, videos, so on and so forth.
Yes.
Below. And that's something that we will be providing for you, the audience.
Yeah, because I think I can speak for Caleb here. Like, tell me if I'm wrong. I'm speaking for you. Like, I can speak for Caleb here and saying like we want to touch on, I guess, kind of like broad open strokes about like, oh, this, and we saw this and we saw that, but we also want to provide those links to the material so like you can go on. This can be like a leapfrog, a starting point for you to research yourselves and actually come away with your own educated opinion and your own decision about how you will vote come voting day. So yeah, like by no means is this exhaustive, but we hope it can be like the start of that process for you if you're not already in that process of actually deciding how you will vote on the day. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Man, I'm a little bit nervous. You feel the same? Like,
Yeah. No, I definitely do feel that way. But as we've been getting more into it, I feel a little eased and
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I wouldn't say like I'm not nervous about the subject itself and about talking about it. I've been thinking about this coming up to this. I feel nervous because I want to do a good job on it. I want to actually make sure that what's said. I don't know about you, but that's certainly my feeling around it. Not nervous about the subject, more nervous about how it comes across. Yeah.
I want it to be terrible.
So, what are you nervous about then?
My goal is to come across someone who isn't for what I want, and make people hate that, so then they'll vote in my favor.
That's compelling.
It's sophistry 101.
Man, have you considered politics? Like,
More advisory roles, yes.
Yeah. So to start off with, man, like we thought we'd actually look at your side of the bill, as it were, first. We'd actually look at your topic first. Why don't you just kind of give us a bit of like a summary as to what's being entailed by this piece of legislation around cannabis?
Yeah, so this bill is an addition or an amendment rather to the Misuse of Drugs Act of, I think it's 1976. I may be wrong there, but we will have that corrected in the comments or in the bio. Sorry.
We like to engage with our audience.
Yeah, very much so. Leave a comment on what you think, but please do. So this bill, according to the New Zealand government, is about restricting access to cannabis. It is about opening access to cannabis as well. It is about reducing harm from cannabis. It is about monitoring and, for lack of a more political word, controlling the production and supply. And I don't mean that in a negative way necessarily. And it's about trying to educate the public on the harms of cannabis and the false information that may be out there about harms as well. So that's the basic summation of what this bill appears to be about. Some basic, I guess, things that you can just find just with a quick Google about it is typically it's that people 20 and up will be able to buy certain amounts of cannabis. They will be able to grow a certain amount within their home and share it amongst friends, smoke it on private property and possibly in licensed premises, but not in public. One other big thing that I will be touching on briefly is that it is aimed to reduce criminal profitability from the cannabis market or the cannabis black market. And also the government aims to restrict access for youth to cannabis.
Okay, and so there's a couple of interesting points. Like, I guess I'm interested in, as your relative layman,
Yeah.
as this perspective. I mean, did you want to say more there?
No, that's fine.
Perhaps it's worth actually talking about uh, perhaps something of a Christian perspective, acknowledging that there are, I guess, a number of perspectives on this. Like, it's not just one particular view. But yeah, what would you say to that, man?
Yeah, so in regards to a Christian perspective, I at first wanted to go out and look in terms of who's supporting it, who's not, but rather I figured I'd just go right to the Bible itself. I have seen some people point towards things like Genesis 1:29, and God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the face of the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit.
Mm,
You shall have them for food." Some people using that. I've come across some conspiracy theories here and there
mm,
about um, cannabis being used to be burned in the temple,
mm,
in Jewish temples,
mm,
uh, and that Jesus would have smoked the reefer himself. There doesn't seem to be much evidence behind that,
mm,
but it's worth mentioning for anyone who may be interested in looking that up.
mm. I've even heard some people posit that the burning bush that Moses would have saw would have actually been some hallucinogenic experience. I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah, that's one that I came across in
Mm,
that whole thing as well. That had even less, I guess, force or
mm,
strength behind the argument.
mm,
Um, but one thing that I just kept on coming up with was sobriety.
mm,
That was a big thing when talking to Christians or just looking this up myself. And looking in just the New Testament alone, we see Acts 26, 24 to 25 says, "As he was saying these things in his defense, Festus said with a loud voice, 'Paul, you are out of your mind. Your great learning is driving you out of your mind.' But Paul said, 'I am not out of my mind, most excellent Festus, but speaking true and rational words.'"
mm,
So there's an encouragement of being in control of your thought process.
mm,
Uh, Paul, who was saying that, later goes on to say in Romans 12:3, "For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, do not think of himself more highly than he ought to think, but think with sober judgment, each
mm,
according to the measure of faith that God has assigned."
mm,
And we have more things in for anyone interested in looking up more verses about encouraging sobriety. We've got First Thessalonians 5:6-8. We've got First Timothy 2:9, First Timothy 3:2-3, First Timothy chapter 3:11, Second Timothy 4:5.
mm,
The list goes on. There are several others, especially within First Peter, and those are one of the most, I guess, one of the most commonly quoted in regards to sobriety. Be
mm,
sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. And that's First
mm,
Peter 5:8. And this is something I was coming across over and over. And how would I relate this to this bill? Um, Honestly, I found not a huge amount of biblical passages that talk about legalization of things like this or
mm,
restriction, because that
mm,
was just something that was completely unheard of in biblical
mm,
times,
mm,
restricting certain substances uh, on the government end. Um, but in regards to a Christian standpoint of recreational use, it appears that there's not much in the way of hefty arguments to support the recreational use as a Christian.
mm. Yeah, if I may, like, I wonder, there's a conversation that perhaps needs to be had about, like, from a Christian's perspective, and we don't have the time to actually do it at length here, but actually the theological place of law, and actually what law does and actually regulating society. And so then there's there's the extended conversation of actually what instances we regulate for and we regulate against.
Yeah,
You know, I, I, I I think something that comes to mind for me is actually, would not a stewardship mentality apply here? You know, I'm trying to think devil's advocate here, or, you know, angel's advocate, depending on which way you want to look at it. From a stewardship angle, we could look at this like, well, like you mentioned in Genesis 1:29, we have this in the creation. We can actually make good use of it. I imagine a lot of the people who actually would argue against recreational use of cannabis wouldn't necessarily be against medicinal use of cannabis.
yeah,
And I know this is just the drug we talk about, this particular drug, because it's the topical one at the moment. But I do wonder if, I don't know, like, there's a verse I'm keeping in the back of my head, also kind of coming from your side that you're presenting. But I also am conscious, you know, is there a space and a place, you know, where actually this could be used and for the right reasons?
yeah,
I can't think of historical examples, but surely there might be examples where something uh, was bad, but then the stigma around it, the culture around it changed, and actually what was once viewed as bad wasn't necessarily as bad once upon a time. I mean, alcohol once upon a time of much weaker potency was viewed as culturally and even religiously as you know, associated with all kinds of negative connotations, but you wouldn't see that same kind of caricatures anymore. I just wonder, what are your thoughts around like a similar line of thinking or a similar line of reasoning?
that's a very good question in regards to um, stewardship, especially. One thing that a lot of the arguments posit is that this can lead towards using cannabis medicinally.
Mm,
Obviously, this bill is about recreational use and not medicinal use. However, people can then start to self-medicate, which is not always a good thing, but it does provide certain levels of pain relief for some people.
mm,
In as far as evidence in regards to medicinal use, a lot of evidence around this is quite anecdotal. I couldn't find much very strong evidence that says that cannabis helps to heal any ailments.
mm.
It's typically used for anti-nausea or analgesic properties. Uh, and
My understanding, though, if I may, this bill
yeah,
isn't necessarily about medicinal use because apparently that's already legal. Like this bill is purely about recreational use.
mm, yes, yes, it is.
Mm,
So that's something that I guess is maybe less relevant to
mm,
the issue, but more along the lines of when you're mentioning societal and cultural views
mm,
on this. It's interesting because it was only within the last century, less
mm,
than the last century, that cannabis has been legalized. Well, throughout most of the, at least Western world,
mm.
um, and there are different theories around this. When you look up a whole lot of different things um, about government control and some conspiracy theories about uh, prison populations and kind of upping that to make
Hmm.
money with the prison machine. And
Mm.
in the States, that's a very most probably justified argument. Um,
Right, because that's the whole like Reagan war on drugs era. Like
exactly.
there's good evidence to support, you know, even if
Yeah.
it's not necessarily the case, like, you know, it certainly seems pretty damning and pretty hard to falsify. Like there does seem to be correlation, doesn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And in
Mm.
regards to the whole reefer madness
Mm.
press side of things, you know,
Mm.
if you smoke a marijuana, you'll beat up your parents, kind of, you know, that whole thing.
Yeah.
It shows that there was clearly little to no research done by these people
Mm.
trying to fearmonger and scaremonger.
Mm. Man,
And
have you seen some of those public service announcements? They're wild.
yeah,
They're so
quite.
entertaining.
Yeah,
I'll
I
I'll tell you what. I will link the JonTron PSA around drugs in the description. Like, have you seen it? Well worth
oh, I
it.
haven't seen that one. No,
Well worth. Sorry, your train of thought.
no, that's good. I remember maybe I don't know how exactly related to it this is, but my brain is making this connection. Quite some time ago, our ex-Prime Minister John Key was asked about legalizing marijuana. I think it was John Key that was asked about this. He said, "Well, no, it shouldn't be legal because it's illegal now, isn't it?" Um, and I just love that. Love that line of thinking. It's just quite indicative of a lot of attitudes towards things like
Mm.
cannabis becoming legalized.
Mm.
It's, well, there's no point because, hey, it's illegal, so it must be bad for you.
Mm.
A whole lot of other things used to be illegal, and a lot of
Mm.
other things used to be legal.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah,
and
it kind of makes me think of something that I'm sure will come up in the conversation we'll have around end of life. But Danielle Van Dalen, one of the people that I saw, you know, came across in my research around the topics, said how law changes culture. Like it's inevitable over time that actually that comes
yeah,
as a result. So this is kind of like a watershed moment, I think, in New Zealand history because for good or bad, like it will have unforeseen consequences, good or bad, on
yeah,
culture. Um, and I think it's like you're saying, like there's an enculturated historical view that people often operate from that kind of determines how people respond to certain ideas, certain legislation, certain ways of thinking,
mm,
you know, a verse that springs to mind often when I think about this conversation is 1 Corinthians 6 talks about everything is permissible, not everything is beneficial, everything is permissible, but I will not be mastered by anything. Like there's
mm,
this idea of, you know, the Christian ought, you know, Paul in writing to the Corinthian church is actually quoting Greek poets, Greek poetry when he writes that. So he's actually trying to make the statement that, you know, the Christian ought to use that place of discernment to actually say, what is good, what is truth, what is noble and praiseworthy, kind of appealing to Philippians 4 verse, I think it's 6, which, you know, makes that claim, you know, think on such things, anything that's noble, praiseworthy, true, right. But especially that last point, sorry, you're going to say?
no, no, go on. I was just
Yeah.
singing little Sunday school ditty.
Love it. Do it. Just breaking the song. Um, well, I think that point about master definitely relates to your point about sobriety, doesn't it?
Mm,
You know,
yeah,
like we will not be mastered by anything. So, like, which is also a Judeo-Christian value of actually, you know, we shall not make an idol of anything
mm,
before God. You know, and I think that when we give over to addiction and kind of mastery, um, that can be an inevitable result. But then again, recreational use isn't necessarily. I think we flirt with that idea of like, you know, we could become mastered by it, but it doesn't necessarily result in addiction. But
yeah.
yeah, like, were you able to find any statistics around kind of the, you know, here or otherwise, like actually around the uptake rate when they have legislated, they have legalized cannabis in other countries, and whether there was an increase in certain addiction rates?
Yeah, so I was able to find some things. it seemed that, say, for example, Colorado and the United States, when they legalized it, they seemed to have a decrease in general usage, both from the black market and the general and those buying it legally and consuming it legally. However, further studies, though those were very early studies, and further studies started to show that that may not have been the case.
Any statement on age with such studies? Like, what was the age range of users?
I didn't pay much attention with the Colorado one. However, I did see in with Canadian studies, people, I think it was below 24, 15 to 24, which is the typical youth bracket, especially in regards to cannabis studies. It seems that there was a significant drop. I think it was something like, and I'll correct this if I'm wrong, 30% amongst youth, but in terms of adulthood, not much of a change. Overall, it's actually quite hard to find a lot of quite objective studies around this because it's such a politically divisive topic. And I've been finding numbers that show that it stagnates, numbers that show that it stagnates after going up or down, numbers that say it goes up, ones that say it goes down, and that's one of the things, even with peer-reviewed article and studies, it's quite a hard thing to find genuine objectivity. Just as a side note, I remember finding a few years ago, seeing a peer-reviewed article that my wife showed to me that came from a doctor in India, talking about the efficacy of, I believe it was leeches, and endorsing it. And this was peer-reviewed, and bloodletting. So this is something that we need to keep in mind when we see peer-reviewed. It doesn't mean this thing is gold standard. Those peers may not be worth much at all in terms of their academic prowess. But overall, usage, it's actually hard to give a solid number. It seems that it does decrease amongst youth. And that's something that, as I mentioned earlier, our government is aiming to bring through with this, the age restriction being 20 for purchasing and using. And on that note, I do find that a little bit arbitrary personally.
Why arbitrary?
Well, I find a lot of age restrictions to be quite arbitrary anyway. But more specifically, one of the reasons it's given for the 20 as opposed to 18 is that is typically because the frequent or semi-frequent use of cannabis in someone whose frontal lobe has not fully formed or developed can cause some developmental delays in that frontal lobe and in other areas of life. And
this is proven on like long-term cannabis use. Is that the argument?
Yes. And one thing that's been found is that in previous years, it used to say that the average male doesn't develop his prefrontal lobe till about 25. The more modern consensus amongst the psychiatric community is that it's now about 30.
That doesn't place us well, does it?
No. Obviously, you and I are pretty quick developers. You know?
So I shouldn't be saying 420 blows it like right now, like.
No, at least not until the until you turn 30, and then you'll be safe. Just to be,
beyond reasonable doubt. Yeah, love that.
Yeah.
They'll fly in court.
I would,
Um,
that is the average, and I would say you and I are above average.
is 20 like the age, uh, the golden standard in most countries?
I actually I saw a mix in different countries. I know
Mm,
that in, say, one of the most well-known Western countries, at least, where cannabis is legal,
mm,
the Netherlands, it's 18.
mm.
Um, for a time, it was that you also had to be a Dutch citizen, but they didn't really police that much.
Yeah, I have heard that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the Netherlands in October of
Mm,
2019, and I was in Amsterdam.
mm,
It was it was everywhere, and you knew that people weren't asking for your passport. Um, I could tell you just walk past the cafes and see people smoking inside them, and
mm,
they're dressed like tourists,
mm,
and
mm,
yeah,
mm. Um, so, like, I'd love to ask you some particulars around some of the bill that I've seen and I've heard. Um, like, so you mentioned, for example, the fact that there'd be a daily prescription of how much people would use, and people could get this from, say, uh, registered dealers. Um, can I,
authorized dispensaries.
right, authorized dispensaries. So I mean, one thing I saw online was a graphic like that talked about which businesses are actually well placed to actually monopolize on that. And surprisingly, it's like talking like McDonald's and Burger King are like, some of the businesses best placed to actually start having authorized dispensaries. I don't
Yeah,
know if that's a money thing. Like, I don't know. Have you heard anything about that? Seen anything around that? Or
yeah. So one of I didn't actually come across any numbers in regards to that, but
mm,
one, I guess my assumption would be, because that reminds me of how a lot of when new fast food chains come into the country, they
mm,
often tend to test them in lower socioeconomic
mm,
neighborhoods, because
mm,
lower socioeconomic people tend to be the prevalent consumers of unhealthy and fast foods.
mm,
So that could be lined up because, again,
mm,
um, illicit drugs or psychoactive substances are found more in lower socioeconomic
mm.
neighborhoods. So that may be part of that reasoning.
Seems kind
It
of
may
icky and exploitative, but like I can see what you're saying, and like, yeah.
from a purely capitalistic perspective,
Mm.
it's quite ingenious marketing.
Lucrative, yeah, definitely.
Yeah. But I think, and then one could also argue maybe that's a good way to up the sales of Burger King and Macca's is
Mm,
get the munchies and buy some more food.
true. I mean, like on that though, like I've heard that that's quite restrictive on how they are supposed to dispense. Like they can't have signage. Like it's supposed to be kind of quite, kind of like your tobacco, advertising, right? There was that whole
Yeah,
campaign about 10 years ago, which was like, they can't show the actual images of the branding anymore. So it's quite sanitized and quite so like it's not knowing that it's there unless you know it's there, I suppose. Like it's kind of word of mouth. Like, I don't know,
yeah,
like, yeah.
yeah. So there won't be online sales.
Mm,
There won't be advertising.
mm,
Um, there are several restrictions around that, which I found quite interesting because uh, one of the big arguments for um, the legalization of cannabis is that alcohol, uh, in its days where it was even prohibited
mm,
in places like the States in the prohibition days,
mm,
tends to have and produce more harm than cannabis.
mm,
I've spoken to and heard from several police officers that
mm,
often say, I would much rather um, deal with a person inebriated on cannabis than a person who has had too much alcohol.
mm,
And anyone who's been around someone who's been uh, affected by either or both of those substances will know what they mean, because cannabis tends to be a lot more calming and soothing, and it's the hey, like hippies kind of have that that stereotype for a reason, and alcohol tends to make a lot more people quite aggressive.
Mm.
And
it's interesting, you know, that. But sorry, you go on. Sorry.
oh no, sorry, and why I bring that up is that it's there's a whole lot of advertising allowed for alcohol. We have liquor stores all over the place that advertise their own sales. We have supermarkets that sell it. We have all kinds of places. Some areas of New Zealand where it's slightly restricted, but still quite in your face as to how prevalent alcohol is. Even alcohol brands often sponsor sports teams, and that's a big that's definitely a big point of contention within the health promotion community at the very least.
So your read on that then, if I gather what you're saying, is that perhaps the restrictions around advertising with cannabis is proposed, I should say, the proposed restrictions around advertising with cannabis is to avoid some of those problems that inevitably become problems, like as is the case with alcohol. Is that your read on it?
Not necessarily, but that is a good point. And that may be the thinking behind some of those who have written the proposed bill.
Do you have any read as to why else that is, or?
Not necessarily. I'm just more commenting on the I guess comparison between cannabis and alcohol law,
right?
And that, but we may also get to a point where alcohol may not be allowed to do sponsorships, may not be allowed to be advertised in such a way. And like I said, the health promotion community are constantly having discussions around this about trying to lessen the amount that alcohol is allowed to be advertised and in the public eye.
And so, like, I've heard, like, with the cannabis bill, like, I used a resource online called Take the Drug Test. So I took the drug test and got it. Like, it's basically kind of dealing with for what I wonder. No. So I took the drug test, and basically it deals with like misinformation, but also addresses some of the common assumptions around the bill. Like, one that I found was interesting, the daily dose that people can actually be entitled to is as much as between 35 and 40 joints. I mean, I don't know about you, like, I'm not a cannabis smoker myself, never have been. Is that a bit excessive, like, that any one person could be smoking between that many daily themselves?
Yeah, so no, I did see that, because one thing that's often put forth by this bill is you're able to buy up to 14 grams of dried cannabis daily. And you're right, that is, as you say, 35 plus up to 42 joints, depending on how you roll it. And one argument that I have seen, which isn't necessarily the best argument, but it's show me the person that can smoke up to 42 joints a day. And I'm not proposing that argument. It's just that's something that I've seen. I believe it was even Andrew Little that potentially said that.
It's between 35 and 40 joints that you could actually get from that daily allowed amount. People can actually have up to 4 houseplants where they're growing cannabis themselves for private use. That seems to me like a loophole that a black market dealer could exploit. Like, that amount. Like, I get what Andrew Little's saying, but it's like, it's not accounting for actually some well-meaning business person who can't be bothered with all the restrictions that are imposed on them and actually creating an authorized dispensary. This seems like a really lucrative business opportunity that I can get on. I remember hearing some statistics around, I think it was Canada, and how they legalized there, and actually the black market consumption actually increased on the back of their legislation for that. and the person who was presenting the statistics was saying, well, you imagine being that scenario, it just makes good business sense to actually continue to be able to, have greater supply and also meet demand at cheaper costs, and cheaper pricing.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
Yeah. One thing I would raise in answer to that is some studies have shown that in Canada that there was a 30% drop in black market activity and revenue in regards to cannabis. But yeah, I do agree that is quite an excessive amount. And that would be something that could be addressed should the bill pass in 5 years' time, because part of the bill requires that there is a 5-yearly examination and
really?
Yeah.
So if it doesn't pass,
not necessarily taking it back to the people to vote or to Parliament, but just to adjust anything that may be working or may not be. Which
I
is
see.
something that I quite liked.
If it passes.
If it passes,
right? I see. Yes. Okay.
Yeah, and that is in the bill itself. And in regards to the whole 2 to 4 plants conundrum, that's also, it can be measured at times, but that is also quite a vague limitation. I remember in my days when I worked as a probation officer, I was dealing with an offender who was on a quite heavy community-based sentence for having grown marijuana in their own home. They weren't charged with intent to dealing because, as far as the Crown could tell, it seemed that there was no selling. They had very limited finances, especially in relation to how much cannabis they had growing in their house. It seemed they just shared it amongst friends and family.
Right.
Anyway, this offender had grown 32 plants. Now, I remember reading the sentencing notes, and this offender actually used this argument to me as well, not knowing that I had read these sentencing notes, that they contested the amount of plants because some of them were just so small, but then some were huge. And I guess a plant is a plant, and that's how the law viewed it, was they were prosecuting based off the amount of plants that were being grown. But again, that speaks to the, I guess, vagueness of this, because 2 plants, 4 plants, some can just be about this big, but some can be quite high. If you look up images of cannabis plantations, under the right circumstances, they can grow quite well. And New Zealand has very fertile soil, and it's very good for growing cannabis.
And just like, I have a couple other things I want to mention as well, but I know this might be worth clarifying. I'm thinking of our dear listeners. Some friends I've talked to have made this correlation between, on the media, they're talking about, politicians visiting hemp factories, and it's kind of like, is it trying to, I don't know, in public opinion, just kind of oh, it's okay, they're the same thing.
Yeah.
Can you speak to that? What is this kind of understanding, misunderstanding, similarities, differences between, say, a plant like hemp and a plant like cannabis? They're same genus, aren't they? But they are different plants.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can't speak to the direct biology of it, but I do know that for a long time, hemp has been legal in New Zealand.
Yes.
I'm not entirely sure on the laws around growing it. I know it's quite restricted, but I have used hemp products for a long time. I've for a long time used a hemp-based beard oil. And I know people who have used even hemp reusable nappies for their children.
Yeah.
And it appears to be quite a, I guess, what's the word, flexible or multi-use plant. That
Yeah, it's like nature's super plant. A lot of advocates call it.
definitely.
Yeah.
And so long as it doesn't have the THC,
Mm.
you can't get high from it. It's kind of like, I once heard someone, and I think it's even less so. It's like trying to get drunk off chocolate liqueurs, you know, or a bottle of bitters that you can buy from the supermarket. You know, you'll throw it before you get drunk.
Yeah. That's apt. I like that.
Yeah. So there may be some validity to the claims that certain politicians do have an agenda behind that, in terms, especially leading up to this referendum. I'm sure there are some agendas with some politicians trying to make it seem okay, because politicians, as much as they try to represent the voters' interest, they are people who have desires just like us, and a lot of them may want to see it legalized.
Well, because there's a tax argument as well, isn't there? Like if it's regulated and it's taxed, it's actually those funds that are raised, that revenue that is raised by actually the legal selling of cannabis actually better serves the system rather than the current criminalization of it that actually just costs the system. Like, do you have any thoughts around that?
Yeah, definitely. And that's that's something that's been argued quite a lot in support of this bill, and it's something that I would get behind. However, something that I have seen is a lot of arguments that have been used in terms of how much it costs our system, in terms of the justice sector. They seem to be ignoring very recent trends. Now, a big thing that I've found was, people often use numbers from 2007 to 2011. How much money, and this is not even counting how much money was spent on policing in regards to cannabis, the court's time in regards to cannabis, or probationary services in regards to cannabis. This is just in regards to imprisonment.
So it doesn't even count that expenditure. It's just imprisonment.
From 2007 to 2011, the total cost was $12,862,500 New Zealand dollars in that period of time, and that was almost twice as much as the amount for methamphetamine. Methamphetamine being the runner-up to the amount of money spent on imprisonment for drug-related charges.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. So cannabis far leading that in regards to imprisonment numbers. However, in recent times, over the last 2 years, and I found this directly from justice.govt.nz, so from the Justice Department, the amount of charges for, now I couldn't find the exact money because that'll be disclosed at a later date. This is just within the last 2 years. But the amount of charges we can find for drug-related offences entirely has dropped from, in the beginning of 2019, from 21,931 down to 14,961. The amount has fallen by 32% since 2011. But what has grown is the amount of methamphetamine charges.
Growing?
Yes, and what has dropped significantly. So it's grown by about 64% by the looks of it.
Wow.
the amount of cannabis charges in the last 2 years has decreased by 63%.
Wow.
So there's a whole lot less money being spent on this.
Well, see, I wonder about that because it's like you wonder if on the back of public opinion, people are thinking like now is the time to propose such a bill because it seems to be, I don't know, less policed. I've heard it said anecdotally that in a lot of instances of people possessing cannabis and like a police officer pulls up, they won't actually penalize or be punitive or arrest someone for possession of cannabis. It's mostly just in the instances of someone dealing that the police are more punitive, that they're more actually, okay, that's the instance where we're going to bring someone in, we're actually going to get them tried. But, typical guy in the park, 9:30, 10 o'clock at night, cop rolls up to him, he's like, has cannabis on his possession, he'll just take it off him and kind of send him on his way, wag his finger.
Yeah.
You've worked in the justice system, you're probably a bit more aware of what goes on than I am. That's just the anecdote I've heard.
Yeah, no, and I think I can't offer anything more than anecdotal in that regard either. But I think that is, from what I had come across in my time in both probationary services and custodial services for the Department of Corrections, there didn't seem to be a huge amount in terms of heavy sentencing in regards to cannabis offences.
Right.
That offender I was speaking of previously did have a history, and they had only received a sentence of, it was less than 2 years, I believe, of intensive supervision. Now, intensive supervision is typically one of the higher of the rehabilitative sentences, more extreme of the rehabilitative ones, but it is a rehabilitative community-based sentence. This person did not have community detention, so they were not monitored in regards to their whereabouts. They didn't have any curfews. They didn't have that. All they had to do was report in to a probation office semi-regularly, regularly at first, and attend certain drug or alcohol courses. So I would agree that it does appear to be that the justice system has changed their thinking at the very least in regards to how we treat cannabis related offences.
What do you make of the fact that cannabis is, like, in and of itself, it's quite a... Cannabis refers to a lot of different plants, doesn't it? And I see it as problematic that actually you can grow certain strains that could, well be classed as a class C drug, but then like strains that are so potent they could be as strong, with hallucinogenic properties to make them a class A drug. Like, I don't know, am I misinformed here, or like that just seems problematic that you can have a drug that has such variety and such variation, and that blanket approach, cannabis can be grown in New Zealand. That seems troubling.
Yeah, definitely. One of the things I can't speak to different strains in terms of just the dry cannabis and its effect. What I do know is THC oil, which is a bit of a process. That process is quite dangerous at times. It's extremely flammable. Working in corrections, I heard of so many stories of house fires started by people creating cannabis oil. Cannabis oil is typically used in the production of consumables, brownies, lollies, etc. And it's much stronger. It has a much stronger potency than your typical amount of dried cannabis leaves or buds. And I think you do have a good point there, that it is quite strange that there is this level of potency and it's just all legalized, but then again, if we legalized growing in home, people have access to the seeds, they have access to the buds, they'll be able to create this on their own. The cannabis bill does address, I can't remember exactly how, but I was reading through the bill and it does address further measures being taken to combat how much dispensaries or providers, licensed providers, can give away in terms of oil-based products or just cannabis oil itself.
Does it police much in terms of, say, THC or DMT, like, levels in, say, individual products? Because, like, I mean, I've heard pretty excessive percentages, like, your typical strain is like, maybe 10 to 14%, but then this legislation, I may be wrong, maybe my sources are wrong, I've heard in excess of 30% or higher can be allowed in some of these products. So that seems again worrying to me. Like if DMT is like a hallucinogenic substance, and THC is the the serotonin related kind of give me, like, I'm not a biochemist, but
I probably should have taken a crash course in
yeah, like, I don't know, like it seems worrying that it seems on a lot of counts the bill seems the restrictions are quite wide, quite sparse, like to allow for something that actually has such a potency in like a chemical form compared to what is currently allowed in other countries, like comparatively. I don't know if they're just trying to make it as wide as possible to make it as Andrew Little's kind of I guess cavalier statement. It's like, show me the person who can smoke 42 blunts. It's like, show me the person that can regularly, smoke 40%, THC quantity, strains of marijuana. What's that?
Snoop Doggy Dog.
Yeah, well, exactly, right? Like it's someone who's a regular user. So who are they legislating for in a bill like that? It seems very excessive. Why not be more restrictive and actually say, no, up to this amount is fine?
Yeah. Well, so to that first bit, I do believe there is some level of policing in terms of the levels of THC within those oils and other things. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, or if that's even if it is a significant amount. If one wanted to look into that, they'd have to look into the bill, which we will link in the description. However, in regards to your second point of who are they policing this for, and should we have this amount, I guess a devil's advocate argument that I could make in response to that, but I don't know if I'd call it devil's advocate, because I kind of agree with this argument myself, is and this is a wider topic than just cannabis. This is actually in relation to all psychoactive substances and illicit drugs. I would point to the Portugal method. Are you familiar with what happened there?
It does ring a bell, but educate me and our dear listeners. I would love to know.
So what happened, for those who are unaware, Portugal was, up until I think about the 70s, part of a quite severe right-wing authoritarian, a lot say dictatorial government. There was a liberation from this in the 70s, and they became a democratic nation. One thing that they found was there were a lot of people flooding drugs into the country. Before you knew it, there was a huge, massive drug problem. By 2001, I think it was about 1% of the population, which was about 100,000 people, were addicted to
Wow.
heroin.
Wow. And that's just heroin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 100,000 people addicted to heroin. They had other drug problems, but heroin was the primary concern. Then what started to happen was the Portuguese government decided to sit down with a lot of drug counselors, doctors, professionals in the industry, and they took their advice, which was decriminalization of any and all drugs. Now, that didn't mean that dealers were to walk free. They still had quite a hefty sentencing should they be charged and convicted. Leading up to this, I should add, when they started having problems, at first they took a blanket approach to charge all drug users, be they just a user or a dealer, as a dealer.
Okay.
They found that wasn't working because, surprise, surprise, whenever we up the punishment, it doesn't down the offending rate.
Is that quite well known in the justice system as well?
Yes, one can look to America for that as a huge example. Norway was a country that turned that around entirely, but they got quite lucky because they have oil money. So, but yeah, so what happened was they decided to begin the process of decriminalization of all drugs, and instead of spending excessive amounts of money on prosecution of offenders, they started spending money on drug and alcohol addiction services, needle exchange programs, counseling services.
Right.
They currently have drug counselors who walk the streets and go into drug hotspot areas on the streets and give them new needles or pipes, should they need it, and talk so that they can mitigate any HIV or hepatitis spread, that kind of thing.
So less of a crime problem, but more of a health problem, like public health problem.
Definitely. And going back to mentioning the health promotion community earlier, a lot of promoters will definitely say that drug use is not a crime problem so much as it is a health problem. And what ended up happening was within, I think it was just a little over 10 years, the drug problem, especially with heroin, halved. So it went down to 50,000 people on heroin within 10 years, thereabouts. And I believe that's a similar kind of issue, is if there's less taboo around it, I do believe that you will see less people offending in this regard. And this goes on another, this I guess relates to another issue, that a lot of people think that cannabis is a gateway drug. There's no studies to show that it actually is. What tends to happen is people who tend to smoke cannabis in countries or states where it is illegal tend to be surrounding themselves with criminal people, and then they're going more and more into the rebel side of things. And not only that, but then if they find themselves caught up in the justice system, they find themselves in prison, which, if you want to survive in prison, one of the best ways is to join a gang. And it makes it pretty hard going if you don't buddy up with the more criminal side of things in prison.
Yeah, I know it's something of like a personal one for me, which maybe factors in why I think I'm still planning to vote the particular way I'm planning to vote. I think this matter I see it like in voting in a particular way that I'm thinking of voting. It's personal for me because I have a family member who started on, something as comparatively tame as, say, cannabis. At least that's what this legislation is proposing, right? But, towards the end of their addiction, this family member was, dealing with stuff like meth and morphine quite regularly, to the point where they tried to take their life on a couple of occasions. And it wasn't until the gospel came into their life in a really radical way that they were actually did a total trajectory, very road to Damascus style kind of conversion, that actually turned around for them. But I know in their case it was a matter of cannabis being that starting point. And I think what you're saying about actually cannabis use currently is associated with a lot of other contextual, cultural behaviors and cultural connotations, which perhaps puts you in access or in proximity to other harder drugs. So I guess that kind of leads on for me to that kind of question of, does the delegitimization of what, say, criminals are doing around drug use and exploitation of drug addiction to their purposes, does what this bill is planning to do in delegitimization of their services and their business and their ventures, does it serve to do what it's actually setting out to do in that way? I think it's not even in our recent history that we had the whole, synthetic drug debacle that happened. And we had 50 deaths because basically when the government legalized it, notice it's not really talked about in the media as well, and it wasn't at the time either. But when that legalization happened, it's like, oh, we'll allow that. And it wasn't regulated well. And the gangs were placed to actually mass produce, and they produced things that were highly potent and very dangerous and very quickly could have been classed as the same potency as any class A drug, this synthetic cannabis. And as a result, people died because they overdosed on this kind of stuff. And it makes you think well, I heard as many as 50 deaths at one point was a statistic that was given. But then again, that's hard to verify because the media wasn't actually picking up on it. They weren't talking about it. And you wonder if it was like a gag on the press, if I'm going to be really conspirational for a bit. But it does make me wonder. I have some skepticism. While I do see restrictions being proposed in such a bill, I'm not sure it's restrictive enough given some of the concerns that I've raised. And I wonder, are we just going to have a repeat of that kind of scenario again? What would you answer to that? What would you say to that? Because I agree with the Portugal example.
Yeah.
But I do wonder if our context is different, I suppose.
That's a very good point. I don't think we have quite the same drug problem that Portugal did have. I can't speak to their levels of marijuana use, but what I can say is synthetic cannabis. That is a good point. However, synthetic cannabis is much more potent, much more psychoactive, and dangerous than cannabis itself. You just with the amount of people that started ODing quite quickly, far surpasses the amount of just cannabis-related deaths that we have in New Zealand. And I think to that also, synthetic cannabis is a whole nother monster that shouldn't even necessarily have the word cannabis in it, in my opinion. I can see why. I've heard about the scientific similarities, or them trying to replicate the THC cell or structure. But when I've spoken to users of multiple drugs in prison, out of prison, not even working in corrections, they have told me that it is a whole nother ball game. and a completely different drug altogether.
Hmm.
But you do have a good point in terms of the gangs being ready to pick this up. But I would argue also that the gangs already have it. They are, however, moving more towards methamphetamine, as those numbers I brought up earlier show, and it's been increasing exponentially. Because one thing about meth in New Zealand is we're really good at making it.
I have heard that, yeah.
That's why they call it P for pure, because the standard and the quality of meth is actually quite high compared to a lot of other nations.
Heisenberg would be proud.
Definitely, yeah. Without going into too much detail, we as New Zealanders have even used our Kiwi ingenuity to come up with PAR bombs, PARR bombs. If anyone's interested in looking that up, do it incognito though, you know. So
go on the GCSP watching, right?
yeah. They can't see you as soon as you click incognito mode.
Yeah, or just move your camera across, like.
And that's basically a portable meth lab.
Wow.
That can be a little bit bigger than my head at times. And that's just really number 8 wire Kiwi ingenuity kind of. So yeah, meth is definitely something that's overtaking that. But one thing I would also say is like I said, a lot of the gangs do already have this. I have one friend who will remain unnamed, who is a dealer, and said that they're not going to vote yes. They're voting no.
Oh, wow.
Because they want to keep making money dealing, and it'll make it harder for them. And obviously anecdotal, and that's just one person, but that kind of goes to show that those who are criminally profiting from this may possibly not want this to go through.
What do you make of those who actually, again, are well placed for a bill like this to go past? Like, you know, we're already dealing, we keep dealing in the black market and that method, or like without regulation, we do it at a cheaper price. That actually increases their profit margin, so therefore incentivizes them to keep selling. Like, I mean, I've heard that in some cases overseas. Like,
yeah, definitely. I guess that for sure would happen. There will always be people that will abuse a certain system. The question that I guess one would have to ask themselves is, when they look at all of the facts, do the benefits outweigh that and any other negatives?
right.
For me, for example, it outweighs it. One thing that it does outweigh that is the idea that there will be a lot more employment, especially in sectors in Northland, because they know how to grow it up there, but they need employment up there as well. And this, but one thing that is put forward in the bill is people who are licensed distributors and growers en masse are not allowed to have serious criminal records or certain cannabis related offences.
I see a loophole around that, I guess, if you were that person, if you have family members that have 3 or 4 houseplants at their own property, you could easily dot around and actually, you know, someone could sell in your name while you're actually you're the profiteer, you're the mogul who's actually organizing that, I suppose. But
definitely, and I think there will often be things like that. Like I say, there will always be people that abuse the system. I'm not saying that's just a whatever, ignore it argument. That's definitely something that one should consider when looking into how they vote in regards to this.
Mm. I mean, there are a couple more points I want to do before I kind of ask, what would be your wrap up, man. Like, for one thing, like the political angle is interesting in that, we have this referendum coming up, and the referendum in the part of the cannabis bill is not a binding referendum. So the government are not bound to whatever the result of that referendum is. But I'm of the mind that you will probably see an instance where, if there is a majority that vote in favour, you could probably see the government actually passing that legislation.
Well, whether one is for or against the bill being passed, I would hope that they would hope that that should there be a especially significant majority vote for yes, that the government would do their job and hold to the interests of the people.
Yeah. Did you happen to see the conversation with Chloe Swarbrink, and she had Helen Clark the Honourable Helen Clark on as a guest, and they were talking about this particular piece of legislation?
No, I actually never got around to watching that one.
I don't apologise. I thought it was interesting. Like, I watched the majority of it, not all of it, but I found it interesting how at one point Auntie Helen was talking about how in her term in government, they proposed the Civil Union Bill as a government and to put that into legislation, and that got passed because she was pretty upfront about it in this interview. She was saying because it shifted public opinion enough for actually people to be of the mind to say, oh, well, let's vote for homosexual marriage. On the back of that, actually the Civil Union Bill has actually been allowed for. And like, you wonder, I guess, in a similar way, like war changes culture, we do see these kind of things. People talk about slippery slope or a foot in the door, depending on how you want to look at it. If there will be that same legislative expansion on the back of a bill like this. I mean, you mentioned the fact about the 5-year open to amendment, right? The actual reviewing of what's actually been proposed so far. I wonder if, like, the government actually, and seemingly a lot of the parties actually saying, yeah, no, we'll probably vote yes for this, given that it does seem to be more of a party vote than a conscience vote. If this is the government's kind of concession, we realise that drug use and abuse is a problem in New Zealand. Maybe if this is the drug that we choose to allow for, it causes less problems. It actually, those people who would otherwise be inclined to drug use, here's a concession, use this as opposed to these other drugs. Do you have any thoughts on that? And any thoughts on like the political angle?
Yeah, not so much. I mean, I guess that would all be up to speculation, most likely. It's obviously hard to tell what is going on sometimes behind closed doors. If there are things going on behind closed doors, I'm sure there are. Some who are less conspiracy theory minded than myself would not agree. But I'm going to put myself on an intellectually superior pedestal and say that I'm a realist.
Do it, man.
Honestly,
do it.
Yeah, honestly, I can't speak much to that in regards to it possibly going further. I guess going back to my argument for the Portugal method, maybe that would be a good thing in regards to drugs. Maybe we could stop charging and prosecuting people for possessing small amounts of methamphetamine. So in that way, those who are addicted are much more likely and to go and seek help, and they have a lot less fear because, I mean, meth is already a heavy anxiety-inducing drug. So there's already a lot of fear. So with the added criminal aspect to that, one could argue that maybe that foot in the door or that slippery slope could potentially be a good thing. And again, I would leave that up to the audience to decide for themselves. Is that something that you, if that is something that you believe it may be the case, if it may be a slippery slope, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing?
You know, Auntie Cinda said recently, like, it was a party vote to vote for the end of life bill. So I can tell you that I'll be voting yes for that. But the cannabis bill was not a party vote, so I'm treating that as a conscience vote. So I won't be disclaiming about how I'll vote on that. Like, what was your take on that? Did you read up on that?
No, not too much. But hearing that now, that's an interesting position to take, I guess. Yeah, it seems that more lives are at, I guess, at stake with the former bill, and with the cannabis bill less so. So I guess that could be the reasoning behind that. But no, I can't speak too much to that.
I saw like a comment online that said something like, peak Jacinda is saying publicly she'll vote for the end of life, which will most likely pass based on polls, but not revealing her opinion on the cannabis bill, where the public is much more divided, which I thought that's pretty scathing. You know,
She's such a nice person. She would never play the political game.
Yeah, no, never. We at 2 or 3 Gathered do not, feel comfortable divulging our own personal political opinions.
Anything said by the host does not reflect the opinion of 2 or 3 Gathered as an organization.
Exactly. Just sound clip that end of every one of our podcasts. No, like, it does make me think of another point a little while back. We were joking before we came on, started recording about Elon Musk and, making sure not to burn our chances in a podcast, burn our shot, as it were. Alexander Hamilton fans out there, not going to throw away my shot. But like, I found it interesting. Elon Musk tweeted a little while ago, and like he said, like, it's probably controversial, but I'm going to say it. He said it's not right that people who have been put in prison, treated foully by the justice system, still are in prison on the back of a bill legalizing the use of cannabis or other such drugs that are legalized. Like, if we were to be retroactive, we should actually, those people who have been imprisoned, they ought to be released on the back of such a bill being passed. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I have heard that argument. I found that to be a bit of a weaker argument on some levels, because at the time of offending, those people did tend to be offending, breaking laws that were in existence at the time. Yeah.
May I ask a question to help?
Yeah.
In the purely hypothetical perfect case where someone was just a dealer of cannabis and no other associated crime or behaviors, would you say retroactively that's fair? Like, let's get them out because they should not have been put in that situation if we're to enforce such a bill? Or you'd still say, still no?
Potentially, yeah. That's a really hard one for me. I don't know if I would have an answer for somebody who may have been forced into a certain situation, but we didn't see many records being wiped clean for prostitution related offences when prostitution was legalised in New Zealand. We did, however, see some people's records being wiped clean for older criminal charges such as sodomy. So people who had been criminally prosecuted for living a homosexual lifestyle, we have wiped that. So we have precedent both ways.
That's interesting.
So yeah, so I think that's a really difficult thing to do, and that would maybe be something that the courts could explore.
Well, I imagine that have to on the back of actually such a law being passed, right?
Yeah, definitely. And I think some people would definitely, I know of a lot of prisoners and ex-prisoners that would definitely be keen to have that done. However, when you quote Elon Musk, he is typically referring to the American justice system, and
True. That's fair.
It is a very different world in the States when you come out of prison than it is in New Zealand. It's definitely not easy, that's for sure. I'm not minimizing it, the difficulties that an ex-prisoner faces in New Zealand.
But we have a better track record with rehabilitative justice, would you say?
And we have a lot less workplaces doing background checks than in the States. A lot of even just places, just some small fast food joints or small retailers will be doing criminal background checks in the States. Some still do that in New Zealand, but a whole lot less. And it also, there are, I believe, laws around those checks in New Zealand governing that it has to be something in relation to that workplace and the type of work that you would be doing.
No, that's a good point. Hey man, like, what would you say, I guess, to wrap up on this particular part of the podcast? Like, what would be your things that you would want people to take away, having heard this, about this particular piece of legislation and thinking about how they would vote coming up in this month of October?
Yeah, so I guess some things that I would bring up is this bill. It's something that could be quite interesting in terms of things that it could lead to, as we were talking about in regards to a foot in the door. This could lead to more drug problems in our nation, but it could also lead to more treatment for those who have drug problems. It could lead towards a whole lot less spending in our corrections system and in our policing and justice sector. But some also say that it may not, based on recent trends. And I think one thing that a lot of people need to be wary of is, are they okay with the amount that this bill proposes in regards to the amount that one is able to buy on the daily, the amount of plants that one's allowed to grow in their own private home. Are we satisfied with arguments that state that cannabis does or does not lead towards the use of heavier drugs? The legalization of cannabis lead to more heavy use? And more importantly, will that lead to heavy use amongst youth? And what kind of damage could that potentially have to the development of our youth in our nation? And for those out there who are of the Christian faith, how does this tie in to us being stewards of this earth? I found it hard to answer that question. Maybe you'll be able to find an answer for that yourself. But ultimately, I think if you do the research yourself, and if you have an open mind, then you'll be able to find something that you'll be able to stake your claim in and say, this is what I feel. And it's important that we express to our government, this is what we feel, because that's how a democracy works. And whether you like that or not, if you want to make change, that's how we do it in this system.
Yeah, great thoughts, man. And like, thank you for, you know, your research and your expertise on the area, on the subject. I would also say, like, if anyone wants to keep the conversation going, please check out the links that we've actually put in the description. Like, we want this to be something of a starting point, but also, you know, like we've said in other videos, please engage with us in the comments. You know, we would love to actually keep the conversation going there, and to have people not just discussing with us, but with each other. If this can be something as a springboard for other conversation and, you know, better critique, that people can come away informed about knowing how they'll vote, that's awesome. And particularly for our fellow Christians, brothers and sisters. Yeah, we hope that you come away feeling informed about, as a Christian, what might be your approach to this situation. Speaking honestly for myself, like, I think I'm not against every instance of the use of drugs in different aspects in different countries. Like the example of Portugal is quite a compelling one for me that I have heard anecdotally before. I would probably at this point, it's about the particular ways that's legislated for. And I would say on the back of this bill, it just doesn't seem compelling enough for me to actually comfortably say, I can put a yes to that. Like, I would think I'd need to see more restriction in place, which is why I think I myself will be voting no on this particular piece of legislation. It's not to say if it was reformed or reviewed in another form in the future that I wouldn't say yes, but I think at this point in time, that's where I sit on it. Yeah.
Cool. So thank you all for listening. Stay tuned. Part 2 will be coming soon. We'll be talking about the End of Life Choice Act with Jared as our keynote speaker. So thank you. God bless, and thanks for making it this far through. Give us a like, subscribe, comment anything that you may be interested in saying or asking. For any further information on the things we have discussed, feel free to send us a message, a comment, or check the description. We're linking a lot of our sources in there, if not all of them. Cool.
Love you guys.
To 2 or 3 Gathered.
Bye, guys. Sorry, Caleb.